Welcome to the store. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me.
Jonathan Reed had always been the one to bet on, a candidate that embodied hope in an increasingly cynical world. His campaign was a well-oiled machine, a political juggernaut that seemed unstoppable. He wasn't just the leading presidential candidate, he was a symbol of integrity, the antidote to years of corruption and division. He had the charisma, the policies, and most importantly, the love of the people. Even those who didn't agree with his positions couldn't help but admire his conviction. So, when Jonathan Reed died, the nation stopped. It was a freak accident, a helicopter malfunction during a campaign tour in upstate New York. One moment, the rotor blades were cutting through the crisp fall air, and the next, the entire aircraft was a fiery wreck in the forest below. The media flashed pictures of the mangled metal, followed by the solemn announcement, Jonathan Reed was dead. The outpouring of grief was immediate and overwhelming. Vigils were held across the country, millions tuning in to watch as politicians, friends, and family shared memories of the man they believed would have changed the nation for the better. His wife, Elena, appeared only briefly, her face ashen, her words brief but heartfelt. He was the best of us, and I will never be the same. But that wasn't the end of Jonathan Reed. 3 days later, as Elena grieved privately and the nation prepared for a grim election without its brightest star, news broke. Jonathan Reed was coming back. It wasn't some conspiracy theory or a fever dream of a fanatical supporter. No, this was science, hard, cutting-edge, barely understood science. Jonathan had been part of a covert government experiment, one designed to push the boundaries of life itself. The program, known as Rebirth, had been in development for decades, and Jonathan's untimely death had become its first true test. The experiment worked. Jonathan Reed emerged from the lab with his familiar face, his tall, broad-shouldered frame, his unmistakable presence. But something was different. At first, no one could quite place it, chalking it up to the trauma of dying and coming back. But Elena noticed immediately. It was in his eyes, eyes that once sparkled with warmth now seemed distant, calculating. He hugged her, whispered, "I'm home," but his voice lacked the depth, the emotion, that once defined their bond. The first public appearance after his rebirth was met with awe. People were fascinated, transfixed by the impossible. A man had returned from the dead. He walked onto the stage at a rally, and the crowd erupted into cheers. Jonathan raised his hand in that familiar gesture, his smile tight but present. He delivered his speech, but it was off. The words were correct, the phrases well crafted, but something was missing. The media picked up on it quickly. Commentators who had once sung his praises now asked probing questions. Is Jonathan Reed still the man we knew? Headlines ranged from "The Miracle of Science" to "Jonathan Reed, Man or Machine?" Political talk shows filled their airwaves with debates on ethics and the nature of humanity. Elena watched the coverage from their home, a hollow pit growing in her chest. Jonathan wasn't avoiding her, but he wasn't there either, not in the way he used to be. His touches were lighter, his voice devoid of warmth. She tried to shake it off, blaming her own grief and confusion. But the more time she spent with him, the more certain she became that the man standing in front of her wasn't the same Jonathan she had married. His campaign team tried to brush it off. Peter Grayson, his ever-loyal campaign manager, kept pushing forward. "We stick to the message," Peter insisted. "Jonathan Reed is back, and that's all that matters." But his communications director, Maya Lopez, wasn't so sure. She'd known Jonathan for years, had helped craft his image, his tone, and his connection to voters. She could feel it too, something was wrong, and Jonathan felt it most of all. He knew something was missing, though he couldn't articulate it. It was like he was watching himself from the outside, going through the motions but not feeling the depth of his own life. The memories of his past were all there, clear and sharp, but there was a hollowness to them, like he was recalling someone else's experiences. The first real crack came during a town hall meeting. Jonathan had always thrived in those intimate settings, where he could speak directly to the people, listen to their stories, and connect with them on a personal level. That night, as he stood on the small stage in front of an eager crowd, a young woman approached the microphone. She began to tell a heart-wrenching story about losing her father in a tragic accident, and how she had always seen Jonathan as someone who understood grief, who could help her make sense of her loss. Jonathan listened, nodding at the appropriate moments, but inside, he felt nothing. Where there should have been empathy, a shared sense of loss, there was only emptiness. When the woman finished, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, Jonathan responded, "I'm sorry for your loss," in the same flat tone he had used 100 times before. But this time, it felt wrong. The woman's face crumpled, her tears finally spilling over, and the room grew tense. Afterward, the media pounced. Jonathan Reed, out of touch. Has the rebirth program stripped him of emotion? The questions started pouring in, and Evelyn Carter, his political rival, wasted no time exploiting the situation. "How can we trust a man who doesn't even seem human anymore?" she asked during a debate. "Is Jonathan Reed still capable of understanding what it means to be alive? To feel? To lead?" Jonathan stood at the podium, staring at her, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered the same thing. Was he still Jonathan Reed? The weeks that followed were brutal. His once solid lead in the polls evaporated, and Evelyn's campaign surged as she framed herself as the candidate who could truly connect with the people. Jonathan's speeches became more robotic, his interactions more strained. Even his most loyal supporters began to waver. At rallies, the crowds were thinner, the cheers more subdued. In private, Jonathan wrestled with his identity. The memories, the thoughts, the actions, they were all there, but the essence of who he was seemed to be slipping away. Late at night, he would lie in bed beside Elena, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of his existence pressing down on him. Elena, once his anchor, was now distant, too. She had stopped asking how he was, stopped reaching for his hand in the dark. They were both haunted by the same question: who was this man lying beside her? As the election neared, the pressure mounted. Jonathan's team was fractured. Peter insisted they stay the course, hammering home policy points and emphasizing Jonathan's accomplishments. But Maya was losing faith. "He's not connecting with people," she argued in one heated meeting. "They can feel it. Something's off." Behind the scenes, whispers of conspiracy began to circulate. Had Jonathan Reed been altered? Was the rebirth program part of a larger government agenda? Some claimed he was now a puppet, his mind reprogrammed to serve powerful interests. Others believed the process had simply gone wrong, stripping him of the very humanity that had made him so beloved. As the rumors swirled, Jonathan's campaign struggled to stay afloat. Evelyn's attacks grew more pointed, her rhetoric more aggressive. She called for a full investigation into the rebirth program, framing Jonathan as a potential threat to national security. "We need answers," she demanded during a nationally televised debate. "The American people deserve to know if the man they're voting for is still Jonathan Reed, or if he's something else entirely." That was the moment everything changed. Standing under the harsh studio lights, facing a live audience of millions, Jonathan snapped. He had always been calm under pressure, always in control. But now, the weight of his existence, the endless questions, the doubts, They all came crashing down. "I don't know," he shouted, his voice cracking. The audience gasped. Evelyn stood frozen, caught off guard by his sudden outburst. "I don't know if I'm still the man I was," Jonathan continued, his hands trembling. "I don't know what happened to me when I came back. I feel like I'm living someone else's life, like I'm trapped in a body that isn't mine. You all want answers, but so do I." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since his rebirth, Jonathan was raw, exposed. The polished facade had crumbled, revealing the fractured man underneath. The debate stage was thick with tension, and the audience sat in stunned silence, trying to process the emotional outburst they had just witnessed. Jonathan stood there, breathing heavily, his hands still shaking. The studio lights seemed harsher than ever, and for the first time in his political career, he felt utterly vulnerable, stripped of the armor that had always protected him. Evelyn Carter's poised expression faltered for a split second, her political instincts warring with the unexpected turn of events. She had aimed to expose a weakness, but what had just happened was far more raw and unsettling than she could have anticipated. The moderators exchanged uneasy glances before one of them finally spoke up, their voice steady but cautious. "Mr. Reed, would you like to continue?" Jonathan felt the weight of a million eyes on him. His campaign team, his supporters, his critics, all of them watching, waiting for what he would do next. But for the first time since his rebirth, Jonathan didn't care about the optics or the strategy. Something had cracked open inside him, and he wasn't sure he could close it again. "I've been lying to myself," Jonathan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, but the microphone caught every word. "I've been pretending that I'm still the man I was. But I'm not. And I don't know if I ever will be again." The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the cameras, capturing every second of his breakdown. Jonathan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I can't stand here and ask you to trust me when I don't even know if I can trust myself." The moderators seemed unsure of how to proceed, but the debate format no longer mattered. This was no longer about sound bites or policy positions. It was about something deeper, something that no one had planned for. Evelyn, sensing the shift, hesitated for a moment before responding. Her voice was softer now, less combative. "Jonathan, the people want a leader who understands them, who can feel what they feel. Are you saying you're no longer capable of that?" Jonathan met her gaze, his eyes hollow. "I don't know. I don't know if I can feel anything the way I used to." Evelyn studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you for your honesty," she said, before turning to the moderators. "I think that's all the voters need to hear tonight." The debate ended abruptly, with no clear resolution, but the damage had already been done. As Jonathan left the stage, the weight of his confession pressed down on him, heavier than anything he had ever carried. Peter Grayson rushed to his side, his face pale with panic. "What the hell was that?" he hissed, trying to keep his voice low as they walked toward the waiting car. "You just handed the election to Carter." Jonathan didn't respond. He couldn't. He felt numb, disconnected, as though he were watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. In the days that followed, the media exploded with coverage of Jonathan's outburst. The headlines were brutal. "Jonathan Reed breaks down on national stage. The candidate who doesn't know who he is." Polls showed his numbers plummeting, and even his most loyal supporters began to question whether he was fit to lead. Evelyn Carter, ever the opportunist, played her cards carefully. She didn't attack Jonathan outright. Instead, she expressed concern for his well-being, framing herself as the stable, reliable choice for voters. It was a brilliant move, one that solidified her lead as election day approached. Jonathan, meanwhile, retreated from the public eye. His team scrambled to control the damage, but there was little they could do. The trust had been broken, and the cracks were too deep to repair. Even Elena, who had stood by him through the worst of it, seemed distant, her eyes filled with a sorrow that Jonathan couldn't reach. One evening, as they sat in their living room, Elena finally spoke. "I don't know who you are anymore," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're here, but you're not you. I don't know how to love a man I can't recognize." Jonathan stared at her, wanting to say something, anything that could bridge the chasm between them. But the words wouldn't come. He didn't know how to explain the emptiness inside him, the sense that his soul had been replaced by something hollow and cold. All he could do was nod in silent agreement that in the final week of the campaign, Jonathan made the decision that would define his legacy. During a hastily arranged press conference, he stood before the cameras, his expression solemn. "I've come to a difficult decision," he began, his voice steady but devoid of the usual political polish. "Over the past weeks, I've come to realize that I am not the man I used to be. And while I believe in the power of technology to improve our lives, I also believe that the essence of leadership comes from the heart, from the ability to truly connect with others." He paused, glancing at the reporters in the room, their pens poised, their cameras rolling. "I no longer believe I can be the leader this country needs. And for that reason, I am withdrawing from the race." The room erupted into chaos, reporters shouting questions, flashing bulbs capturing the moment. But Jonathan didn't stay to answer. He turned and walked away, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him. The weight he had been carrying for so long was finally lifted, the nation was stunned. In the days that followed, the media struggled to make sense of his decision. Some called it an act of cowardice, while others hailed it as a moment of profound self-awareness. Conspiracy theories abounded, with some claiming that the government had forced him to step down, while others speculated that the rebirth program had malfunctioned, leaving Jonathan mentally unfit. But for Jonathan, it didn't matter anymore. He had made peace with the fact that he would never be the man he once was. The question of his identity, of whether or not he was still truly Jonathan Reed, would haunt him for the rest of his life, but it was no longer his burden to bear alone. Evelyn Carter won the election by a landslide, her victory speech filled with promises of unity and progress. Jonathan watched from the quiet of his home, feeling a strange detachment from it all. The world moved on, as it always did, and soon, Jonathan Reed became a footnote in history, a symbol of both the promise and the peril of human innovation. In the months that followed, Jonathan withdrew from public life entirely. He and Elena parted ways, the distance between them too great to bridge. He spent his days in quiet reflection, trying to piece together the fragments of his existence. He was alive, yes, but what did that mean? Was he truly living, or merely a ghost of his former self? As the world continued to debate the ethics of the rebirth program, Jonathan found himself grappling with deeper questions. What did it mean to be human? To feel, to love, to connect? Could technology ever truly replicate the soul? Or had his rebirth been a hollow imitation of life, a shadow of what once was? In the end, Jonathan Reed remained an enigma, both to the world and to himself. The nation moved forward, new leaders rising to take his place, new challenges on the horizon. But for Jonathan, the battle was no longer political. It was personal. And it was one he knew he might never win. As he sat on the porch of his secluded home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jonathan allowed himself a small smile. The world would never know the answers to the questions he carried, but maybe that was okay. Maybe some mysteries were never meant to be solved.